Lady Singh Kamaljeet Kaur ji, President of Global Sikh Council, and delegates from member countries across the world. Allow me, first of all, to say that I am deeply honored to be given the opportunity to share some views with all of you at the Global Sikh Council Annual General Meeting here at Amritsar, Punjab. I am informed that the theme for this year's meeting is Sikhi in the 21st century. What I propose to do within the time that has been allotted to me is to lay out what I think are the 6 primary challenges that Sikhs and Sikhi will face as we move forward in the 21st century. Now, because I am making predictions about what will be the challenges to Sikhs and Sikhi in the 21st century, I need to tell you the foundations upon which my predictions are based. So let me begin with my assumptions, and I have 3 of them. The first 2 are about Sikhs, and the third is about Sikhi. The first assumption is that the backdrop of the challenges to Sikhs and Sikhi is the challenges for humanity as a whole. In other words, the challenges to Sikhs and Sikhi will not be fundamentally different from the challenges to humanity and mankind as a whole. One way of looking at this is to say that the challenges to Sikhs and Sikhi are the subset of the challenges for humanity in the 21st century. The second assumption is about the general nature of Sikhs. Understanding this will help us determine the nature of the challenges we Sikhs will face. We can make 3 observations here. The first is that we are a minority just about everywhere in the world. Second, Sikhs are a migrant community, and as migrants, we are very mobile. So we have the phrase second migration, which applies rather disproportionately to Sikhs. One example of this pattern is as follows. One generation of Sikhs migrated from Punjab to Asia. Their second generation migrated from Asia to Europe. Their third generation migrated from UK to North America, and their fourth generation from North America to Australia and New Zealand, and so on. Now, my own parents migrated to Malaysia from Punjab. My children have migrated to North America and to New Zealand. I'm sure such a story resonates with many of you in this room. The third observation under my second assumption is that Sikhs are deeply identity conscious, and that is because we are defined to a large extent and much more than many others by our external identity. Assumption number 3 is about Sikhi, or specifically about the nature of Sikhi as practiced by Sikhs. For a vast majority of practicing Sikhs, the Gurdwara is the focal point. The Gurdwara provides the framework within which Sikhi is practiced. Our Gurpurabs, for instance, and other functions, Ananda Karaj, Margada Bhog, Akhand Path, etc., are all Gurdwara centered. Take the Gurdwara away, and for a vast majority of practicing Sikhs, there would be a big hole in their practical Sikhi. Second, even though large numbers of Sikhs live outside of Punjab and have made Western countries their permanent homes, their outlook towards Sikhi is still very much Punjab-oriented or Punjab-centric. A vast majority of practicing Sikhs in the diaspora still look to Punjab for direction and instruction when it comes to Sikhi practices. They look at the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, the SGPC. They look to Darbar Sahib and they look to Akal Takht to get their direction for Sikhi practice. So these are my three assumptions, and they will form the basis of my assessments as to what I think will be the six main challenges to Sikhi and Sikhs in the 21st century. Of the six challenges, four relate to Sikhs, and I will talk of them first, and the final two will relate to Sikhi. The first challenge is the challenge of globalization. You will agree with me that the 21st century is defined by this phenomena called globalization. Globalization refers to the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations. It refers to the vastly increased movement of goods, services, capital, and people across borders. So why is globalization important to Sikhs and Sikhi? Recall my assumption about Sikhs being migrant and mobile. And this was my second assumption. If you belong to a group that is extremely migrant and mobile, and if globalization is about increased movement of goods, services, capital, and people across borders, then you get a connection. And the connection is in the form of a challenge. Whatever happens to globalization, the good and the bad, will affect you as a group. The economies of nations are more interdependent than ever before. What we have seen is that this phenomena creates opportunities, but it has also created a great deal of instability. This is because access to the opportunities that globalization has to offer are unevenly distributed. Changes in work practices and production models have left many people to become stuck in insecure, low-paid employment. The result is that many citizens feel that they have lost control over their destinies either to distant institutions run by foreigners or to immigrants in their own countries. For some countries, the response has been in the form of a backlash against globalization. The response has taken the form of inward-looking nationalism. In a way, then, nationalism is the antithesis of globalization. Now, such nationalism not only threatens global collaboration and global cooperation that is needed to address challenges like cybersecurity, health pandemics, climate change, refugees, etc., because none of these challenges can be resolved by any country on its own. But inward-looking nationalism also creates a heightened sense of anger towards immigrants. So, migrant communities tend to get blamed for a variety of domestic problems such as unemployment. What this means is that migration is increasingly viewed as a problem and migrants become increasingly unwelcome. As I said, Sikhs being one of the world's most mobile and migrant community, will be affected by such developments. Let me illustrate by an example. Let's take universities. We know that universities are one of the main gateways for professional Sikhs who migrate to developed countries such as the USA, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Now, international students are a valued part of the university community, but are not always perceived positively by people living locally to the host institutions. Here is a report from about 3 weeks ago about 6 students being deported. The report says the 40 students drove around playing loud music for 3 hours, and they blocked the path of a police officer who had been called by the local residents. They have all had their visas cancelled and they have all been deported. One wonders if this had happened 20 years ago and if the penalty would have been different. Without having to condone the bad behavior of the students, we can make the point that international students are increasingly perceived negatively by the locals. We further need to understand that there are 2 kinds of migrations, basically, and that they compete with each other. First, there is voluntary migration, which is also known as economic migration. And this is stimulated by economic factors, including the belief that another country offers better prospects. This is controlled migration. Countries can set both the volume of migrants and the kind of immigrants that they will accept. Sikhs who migrate all over the world mostly fall in this category. The other category is forced migration. Under this category, migrants are driven by factors such as environmental degradation, as well as war and persecution of minorities. This is the kind of migration that is uncontrollable. When millions of displaced persons push across the borders of states, it becomes increasingly difficult to control the volume and the type of people that could be allowed in. What the 21st century is seeing is an increase in environmental degradation, conflict, and war. This means an increase in the numbers of forced migrants. Afghanistan is case in point. As members of the Global Sikh Council, you know this story very well because of your direct involvement in handling forced Sikh migrants out of that war-torn country. The 21st century will see a greater degree of conflict across the world. Why is this so? Because technology allows for conflict to spread faster than ever by enabling factions and groups to work across countries. The 21st century is seeing a rise and spread of asymmetric conflicts. War is not just country A against country B. War is increasingly groups against their own state. There is also the phenomena of wars getting exported to other territories. Now, we know that conflict and war is often triggered by access to resources. This is made worse by climate change, which limits resources. In such an environment, we see a fear of migrants who are viewed as taking away resources from local populations. We know that conflict and war are major contributors to environmental damage. In other words, War contributes to environmental damage, and environmental change triggers wars. So, what we have here is a cycle. We know that such cycles are difficult to break. This is what the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, says. In the first few months of 2022, 100 million people were displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights abuses. 100 million. This is more than the entire population of Germany. 40% of these forced migrants are children, making the problem even harder to ignore. So, when forced migration figures go up, voluntary migration has to take a backseat. It's just simple maths and logic pertaining to the ability of a nation and its citizens to absorb migrants. I want to talk about the third challenge, maintaining our identity. Two diametrically opposed trends are seen happening in the 21st century, and they are the direct outcome of globalization. The first one is that there is emerging a greater diversity of views, beliefs, groupings, and movements, allowing people to connect in new ways. So, this is a trend which values and appreciates and welcomes diversity. The second trend is that we are seeing people go back to older social norms and beliefs in search of security. People becoming more fundamental in their identity. People wanting to reject the diversity. In some cases, people's chosen identities continue to incite violence and abuse. So, what we have on the one hand is a broadening of identity, and then we also have a narrowing of it, most likely as a reaction to the broadening. These tensions play out in a variety of ways, one of which is a backlash against immigrants. The question for Sikhs is two-dimensional. One is, how do we react to the narrowing all around us? And second is, which of these two trends do we embrace ourselves? Do we hold on stronger to our identity, or do we give up parts of it for the sake of peace within the majority communities around us? So, those were the three challenges to Sikhs: globalization, mobility and migration, and maintaining our identity. Let's move on to challenges to Sikhi. Challenge number 4 then is about our religious leadership. Sikh religious leadership does not enjoy a reputation for being one with a vision or foresight. The general theme in Punjab, where our religious leadership is based, has been one of us versus them, of conflict, and of the notion that we are discriminated against. The main theme that our leadership has relied on has been to highlight tensions between the minority and the majority. Their main call has been that Sikhi is in grave danger of being swallowed by the majority. Calling for protests, organizing agitations, and holding demonstrations has been the way. This has led to massive loss of life and immense pain and suffering within the Sikh community. Equally, it has led to a loss of confidence in our leadership because nothing substantial was ever achieved through such methods. It seems like our religious leadership does not have answers to our most pressing problems, and calling for protests, agitations, and demonstrations works as a diversionary tactic. Take the example of the conversion issue in Punjab that we are facing today. While researching and writing on this issue for the Sikh Bulletin, I communicated with Sikhs in Punjab and outside. I have not met anyone who tells me that they feel the Akal Takht and the SGPC or any other Sikh religious leadership in Punjab knows what to do. Worse, very few Sikhs even think that our leadership knows what the problem really is. It appears that our leadership is in denial of its own failures. So the fear is that the resolution to this conversion issue will fall within the parameters of conflict, that we will have to be in conflict with the Christians to resolve it, that we have to present the Christians as people out to destroy Sikhi. I'm sure many of you are wondering if the Sikhs of Punjab will go through yet another round of protests, agitations, demonstrations, and violence. Perhaps some of you are wondering as to why we are talking about Punjab, even if the Global Sikh Council is not entirely about Punjab. Recall my assumption that for a vast majority of Sikhs across the world, Sikhi is still Punjab-oriented, still Punjab-centric. What happens in Punjab does not stay in Punjab as far as Sikhs are concerned. Sikhs do have formidable organizations in the USA, in UK, Canada, etc. But our default mode is to depend on our organizations in Punjab, no matter how ineffective they are. So the question now is, how does the 21st century, or more specifically the challenges of the 21st century, have a bearing on Sikh religious leadership? What makes for the 21st century is the increasing pace of change and the expected speed of response. Problems are coming up faster and we need speedier responses. Such a situation does not leave time for reflection and there is constant pressure to move into the next thing. So what we get is short-term responses which arise from an inability to devise solutions needed to address deeply embedded issues. The 21st century leadership models talk of a system leadership approach. The models talk of refining moral leadership, promoting local collaboration and broader engagement across society, as well as drawing on shared and diverse narratives to inform decision making. This is the 21st century leadership model. And how Sikhs are going to adapt to this 21st century model when we haven't really had a working 20th century model is the question. What was the 20th century model? Well, it was based on values such as democracy, inclusiveness, fairness, etc. Were Sikh religious institutions democratic and inclusive? Is the SGPC democratic? Is it fully representative of Sikhs across the world? It is difficult to answer in the affirmative when you have one man heading the institution for 27 years, mostly without any elections. Is the Akal Takht inclusive? Again, difficult to answer in the affirmative when the practice is to sanction those who don't agree with its methods. And this is the 20th century model we are talking about, the one that we did not have. So how do we transition to a 21st century one? So this is going to be a formidable challenge for Sikhi. The gist of 21st century leadership models is that leadership can no longer be held by a small group. It must be shared across organizations where members take responsibility for their actions in agreed frameworks of accountability. Challenge 5 is what we can call institutional disaffection. One of the things we see about the 21st century is a challenge to the traditional structures, traditional instruments, and institutions that define society, be they social, political, or even religious. Changes in media technologies have amplified this disaffection. Media technology has enhanced the desire for change amongst people where a form of new people power has emerged. The immediacy of social media contrasts sharply with the slow deliberation of institutions, adding to a sense of disconnection from established institutions. An example or two may help explain this principle. Say someone gets cheated by a used car salesman. The old way was to look for the right agency to complain to, and this search took time, and it may entail being given the runaround from one department to another, one unit to another, one agency to another, then wait for the agency to do something, if at all. Nowadays, people post a write-up of their negative experience somewhere. A negative review of a hotel, an airline, or a restaurant gets you fast results. Businesses apologize, offer refunds, and change their ways of doing business. This is what I mean by the immediacy of the social media. So people don't really need to go to traditional establishments to get solutions to their problems. This is also what I mean by disconnecting from established institutions. From the Sikhi point of view, our youth are getting dissatisfied with our dysfunctional institutions. At the lowest level of our institutions are our gurdwaras. Gurdwaras are increasingly seen as failed or failing institutions when it comes to Sikhi. At the very least, they are dysfunctional. They have been reduced to places of social interaction. The pandemic took that away. The gurdwaras closed for various periods of time and people found other ways of conducting social interactions. But even if the pandemic effect resolves itself, it does not assure us that our gurdwaras will become functional and effective on their own. So the challenge is relevance of gurdwaras in the lives of Sikhs in the 21st century, especially Sikh youth. You know, when the churches became irrelevant in some Western countries in the 20th century, we Sikhs bought up many of them and converted them to gurdwaras. And now, our own gurdwaras are becoming irrelevant. What about Sikhs who still find the gurdwaras relevant for their spiritual needs and that of their families? What about Sikhs who actually care about the philosophical aspects, about Gurbani, about Gurmat, and about the contents of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, and want to bring these aspects into their daily lives? These Sikhs will face a different sort of a challenge. And this brings me to the sixth and final challenge, the challenge of a deep-seated ideological divide. Let me first say that the 21st century will see a severe decline in Sikhs who actually care about the philosophical aspects, about Gurbani, about Gurmat, and about the contents of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. There are no visible trends or discernible developments that indicate otherwise, which is why in my assumptions slide on the practice of Sikhi, I did not include Gurbani, Gurmat, and the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. This is my assumption slide, the one I showed earlier. As you can see, there is no mention about Gurbani, Gurmat, and the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And that's because Gurbani, Gurmat and the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji do not factor very much into our daily Sikhi practice. The Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji does enter into the equation, but only in a ritualistic and symbolic sense, as an object of ritual and worship. But for those Sikhs for whom Gurbani and Gurmat does matter, the challenge will be this. The challenge will be a divide of ideology, a divide between Tat Gurmat and Dera and Taksali based Sikhi, a divide over Maryada, a divide over what constitutes true Sikhi, a divide about the interpretation of Gurbani, a divide about the sources of our history, Suraj Prakash, Janam Sakis, Gurbilas, Parshai Shemi, Dasam Granth, etc., etc. A divide over our external religious symbols. Are they relevant anymore? A divide over whether Sikhi is unique and distinct or merely an offshoot of existing belief systems. The list is long. I'm not saying these divisions are new or that they didn't exist during the 20th or even the 19th centuries. They did. But there are two major differences, primarily due to the fact that it's the 21st century we are talking about. The first difference is about the intensity of the ideological divide, about its reach, about its scope, all of which are enabled and intensified by technology. The second thing is that these sort of divides need the intervention of our religious leadership, the SGPC and the Akal Takht. We have already seen above that we do not really have a credible and trustworthy leadership. I would venture to say that our leadership, or rather the lack or absence of it, contributes to the problem. At the very least, the leadership at Akal Takht and SGPC is not an honest broker. How can it be when all the Jathedars of Akal Takht and the other four Takhts for the past 5 decades have come from the Dera and Taksal side? In other words, we have a partisan leadership. So, managing this ideological divide, resolving it, will be one of the biggest challenges for Sikhi in the 21st century. In summary then, Pyareo, here are the 6 great challenges of the 21st century for Sikhs and Sikhi at one glance. The chart looks complicated, and that's to symbolize that the challenges are indeed complicated. I have put them into different kind of boxes to highlight the fact that each of the challenges is different in dimension, scope, and consequence. The other thing I want to show here is that the challenges are interrelated. The solid white lines denote a direct cause relationship, while the dotted lines suggest that one challenge influences the other. Take globalization, the box on the top left-hand corner. See, for instance, how globalization is the cause for the identity challenge, how it causes institutional disaffection, how it brings about mobility and migration, and how it brings about the ideological divide. Now, let's take weak religious leadership, the box on the bottom left-hand corner. See how a weak religious leadership is linked to the disaffection people feel towards their religious institutions. See how leadership influences the religious divide. See how religious divide and institutional disaffection are influenced by each other, and so on. The Global Sikh Council is going to be operating within such an environment, within what we can call a 21st century environment. My aim, Pyareo, has been to share with all of you an understanding of this environment in the hope of making the Global Sikh Council effective and relevant in helping Sikhs and Sikhi overcome some of these challenges as we continue to navigate the 21st century. Thank you for your kind attention.